This is KCCK's Culture Crawl. I'm Dennis Green, and my guest today is Professor Michael Collins, who has traveled from California to give a presentation at the Marion Heritage Center about his dad, Arthur Collins, a name known, I think, to everyone in Eastern Iowa as the founder of Collins Radio, now Collins Aerospace. Before I blather on and on and on about all of this, let me just say welcome, Michael. Thanks so much for being here.
This is different. I'm enjoying it.
As Michael came into the studio, he had all kinds of questions about, who makes radio equipment these days, because when you were growing up in Cedar Rapids, Collins manufactured radio broadcasting equipment. I remember using Collins boards and taking readings in Collins transmitters early in my career.
And turntables with these big discs that turned around.
The big 16-inch transcription disc. Well, I want to talk, as we talk here, obviously we want to talk about your dad and about what you're going to be presenting in Marion on the 10th of October, but also talk about your own scholarly research as an entomologist, and also how those things are related. So let's start with growing up in Cedar Rapids. Your dad, of course, is growing his company, but the spark that started that company began when Arthur Collins himself was a teenager, and it's a famous story, but I'd like to hear it from you about Arthur Collins and the McMillan expedition.
I often would go up in the attic of my grandmother's house, and there was a room, empty room. And he never told me the story about the McMillan expedition. She did, my grandmother did. So he's quite modest about this. But he was a member of a group of amateur radio operators in the Cedar Rapids area.
And this is the early 30s, right?
No, this is in the mid-20s.
Mid-20s, okay.
Yeah. And most of his friends had these so-called spark gap transmitters, and they'd make an arc, just like in the movie Titanic in the radio room, and they'd use a key to tap out Morse code. He was able to afford, through his father, my grandfather, these very expensive vacuum tubes, which were used as amplifiers in these oscillator circuits. In other words, you could have a transmitter that was tunable and it would transmit on a specific frequency, and it was quite stable then. And
because up till now, telegraphs had all been closed wires.
Yeah.
So this is the very very early days when over-the-air transmissions.
That's right. And just a few years previous to that, Marconi transmitted across the Atlantic with one of these arc-type spark transmitters. So Dad was born, fortunately for him, just at a time when there was this tremendous revolution and renaissance in radio technology. And oddly enough, he was at a university level as a teenager. And he submitted technical papers on his circuits, which were of a level that you would normally study in a university or college. Anyway, by coincidence, one of his ham radio buddies was his fellow Reinertz, who happened to be the radio operator in the Burgoyne, the ship that was scheduled to go to the northern portions of Greenland and up toward the Arctic Circle. Sponsored by National Geographic and the Navy. Well, Reinertz and Collins had talked about the best wavelengths and procedures to use to establish communication. The trick is that within a certain frequency range, radio beams will bounce off the ionosphere. Now, VHF, the higher frequencies, don't do that. They're more like light. But also, at that time, amateurs were restricted from using all the available wavelengths because they wanted it for commercial and military purposes and so on. So they were operating against some constraints, but they figured this out pretty well before the ship began its cruise. Well, it turned out with the northern lights and sunspots and the normal movement of the ionosphere up and down during the day cycle, the Navy could not establish reliable, continuous communication.
They couldn't communicate with their own ship.
So here's this 15-year-old kid in Cedar Rapids was able to do it because they kind of worked this out, and he had a superior radio. It comes down to that. So we'd cut school. He'd have a communication session with Reinertz, jump on his bike, ride down to the Western Union, and send in the transcript of the communication to the East Coast, to the National Geographic. And that gave him national fame and really provided the basis for Collins Radio.
What was your dad's education then? Obviously, he was self-taught in these days. There were no college electronics courses or anything like that because people were creating it as they went. But
Well, not only that, but he tried going to Amherst, and he didn't fit in too well. And for some reason, he decided to quit after a year. So he was essentially self-taught at the university level. He took coursework at various places and managed to accumulate a few honorary degrees later in life.
Sure.
But he never had a college degree. And that gave him a humorous point of view because he hired brilliant people with advanced degrees, and they got along well, and he worked well with them because he was so bright that he could read a textbook in one night, saw the questions that needed to be researched, and he was able to ask these guys, well, here's something that needs to be solved. You need to write the equations for this. You need to design the circuits, but this is how I think it needs to be done, as an intuitive approach. So we referred to these guys humorously as his geniuses, and with always the underlying tone that I don't have a college degree, but I'm keeping up with you guys. And it was kind of a joke between them.
talking with Michael Collins, who is going to be giving a presentation at the Marion Heritage Center and Museum at 7 o'clock on Thursday, October 10th. Now, you left Cedar Rapids in 1961?
I graduated from Washington High.
Okay.
And I'm grateful for a very good education. That was, I think, a top-rate high school nationally at that time. We had advanced courses. We had the Iowa Test of Educational Development, I think. And
Yeah, which was developed just down the road at the University of Iowa.
Yeah.
But you were in and around and worked. You were in it. You were a part of Collins Radio through your
I did,
youth.
yes. I was at Berkeley, and I took. Of course, there's always this tension because there was an expectation that I'd somehow be involved with the company. But I grew up in the edge of town, and I got interested in nature and insects and evolutionary questions and genetics and all that on my own. And what am I going to do? Well, my schedule was dictated by this invitation I got from the U.S. Army to join up during Vietnam. So I quickly joined the Navy. So I took some time off at the university and worked here in town. Also, after I graduated, I moved to Dallas and helped in various positions down there with my dad. I did a lot of writing and did research projects and so on. But then I got drafted and I joined the Navy, and that pretty much severed my relations with Collins for a while. And by the time I got out of the Navy, then the hard times had come along, and Rockwell had taken over the company.
And in your book, Moth Catcher, which you talk about getting interested in entomology with Alexander Lippisch, who is, and right now the audience is saying, Alexander, where do I Lippisch? Where do I know that name? The answer to that question, by the way, is Lippisch Way or Lippisch Avenue at the Cedar Rapids at the Eastern Iowa Airport. But Alexander Lippisch he worked at Collins, but he was one of the German immigrants after World War II. Engineer.
That's
correct.
right.
Am I getting that right?
That's correct. He was taken into the fold of the Operation Paperclip folks, who were mostly going after the V2 researchers. But Lippisch came to this country. I think he was at Northrop for a while, and then his job at Collins was to integrate flight control and flight display instruments with different airframes, because Collins has an early and very important story to tell about developing these cockpit instruments, which would combine into one instrument what used to take 4 or 5. So it's much easier for the pilot to follow these little displays and these little symbols. Anyway, that was Lippisch's job, but he was always a butterfly collector as a kid. And he found out I was interested in that, and his own daughter, Sybil, as well. And Alex was very supportive of my interests. And at one point, I went around after Christmas and collected poinsettia plants that people were letting die or throwing out, and I'd grab these and bring them back to life. And A friend of mine in Sarasota, Florida, would send me eggs of this moth that's somewhat related to the tomato worm. And I was raising them on this Point City. I was interested in them because they had what we call a polymorphism. They came in all different color phases. Some of them looked like the leaves turning red. Some of them looked like the stem. Some of them looked like the green leaf. And that's an interesting problem in genetics, which I was just starting to be able to understand a little bit. I was raising these moths, and Alex was doing this, what was it called, The Secrets of Flight. If you can find a video of that, that would be amazing to watch. I hope someone's saved that. But he did a homebrew version of that right here in Cedar Rapids. And he would lecture, and he had movies, and it was just a wonderful series.
So he was interested in flight and
Flight is
studied
a phenomenon
and studied insects and birds
anything that
as
flies.
to connect with his own aeronautical research.
Well, one of the features of these moths is, if maybe you've seen these moths at petunias just at sunset, they hover like hummingbirds. So they've got this incredible little gyroscope, and they can back off and approach the flower, put out this big tongue, this proboscis, and get the nectar. But they're like amazing flying machines with these little tiny brains controlling it. Of course, Alex is immediately interested in this, and he gets a hold of a Mitchell high-speed camera. And we built this little cage, and we had all these people around and turn all these lights on. Well, this is scaring this poor little moth, seeing these big vertebrate eyes staring at it and all these lights on. But it did manage to fly in front of the lens, and we got a little section of it flying. And Alex is, of course, talking to the moth because he gets very animated. He and his sons would build these ornithopters out of balsa wood, and they could do it in about 45 minutes. Just incredible. And it had a little crankshaft and little levers to make the wings flap on the hinged wings. And I remember seeing them for sale built in Japan at airport stores, that kind of thing. You wind it up and it flaps just like a bird. Well, he made his own design, and this is in the early 60s, late 50s. And he would fly these things around. But he would talk to the model and encourage it to fly over this bush, and he was just a wonderful guy. He looked imposing because he had a high forehead and deep set eyes, and you could tell he was extremely intelligent, but he was also very friendly and approachable.
And this was how you got started on your career as a professor and teacher specializing in entomology.
Yeah, actually, I'm not a professor, but I have a connection with the museum, the Carnegie Museum in Pittsburgh. Well, Dad was very supportive of that. In fact, he collected butterflies and moths when he was a kid, and so if it was a serious endeavor and I was doing a good job, he thought that's fine. Of course, I picked up a lot of electronics, just absorbing it by osmosis right there. But one of the things I wanted to do was, there are all these moths, there's 14,000 species of moths and about, 700 species of butterflies in this country alone. And most of these moths attract the male, the female attracts the male with a chemical pheromone. And the question is, well, how do they avoid approaching the wrong species? Because this would be a huge waste genetically, so Darwinian selection would tend to eliminate those. So you've got to have some way of avoiding hybridizing. Or
picking the right pheromones.
You still have to pick the right partner in life, and the moths have been working on this problem a long time. Well, I realized they were flying at different times of the night. Excuse me. So I thought, well, there's got to be a way to record it. I don't want to stay up all night and count these things. There's got to be a way of recording this. So Dad got a Esterland Angus chart recorder. If you've ever seen a seismograph with a little needle that moves up and down, that's essentially it. But it was a messy, clumsy thing because there were little glass bottles of ink, and if it got on your fingers, it was going to be on there for about 17 years. Couldn't wash it off. And we had a little electric, what we called back then an electric eye, and I had a funnel trap with a stainless steel funnels that Dad and I made. It was a trough, really, not a circular funnel. And you put the female inside the trap, and the males would eventually be persistent, and they'd fall through this gap in the funnel halves, and they'd pass through the beam of light, and it would make a click on the recorder. And it's on a chart, which is wound up, and it goes at a given speed, so you can extrapolate what time of night they were coming in there. So I showed how this pattern works and went into a science fair and got a prize for it or something. But so that's an example of how he was intellectually interested in trying to help me also to develop those interests.
By the time Collins Radio had the big contract for Apollo to do the radio communications for that project, you, of course, were moved away and doing your own thing. But
I was in the Navy fixing Collins gear on an aircraft carrier.
there you go. So you were still connected. But what do you remember about any stories, anything that you heard about those days? The Arthur Collins Legacy Association has produced some wonderful documentaries that tell the story, and you appear on those. You gave some lengthy interviews to the producers. But what are your memories, long distance, of that time period?
The timing of that was such that Dad was developing this computer network C system, which was all-consuming for him. So his involvement in the manned space program and the communications for it was compromised by that. He probably was not able to give it as much attention as he would like. He had some very good people working on that, especially on the unified S-band that Apollo had, which was a much different system than the early ones. The early Gemini and Mercury were essentially derived from existing military aircraft radios, repackaged and with not a lot of frequencies. You'd only needed a few key frequencies. The idea was to cut down the size and the weight. But Apollo was a whole different thing. But he, unlike many projects in which he was intimately involved, he this through, but he was intensely interested in seeing this country succeed. I think he talked about at the landing, just going quietly out into his backyard and looking at the moon, and with a deep sense of pride. I don't know if you're interested in the Cronkite story, which has been told a lot of times.
It's in the documentary, but yes, let's let's hear. Let's for our audience too.
Well, I hope everybody listening, if they're too young to remember, would take a moment to research Walter Cronkite, because he was a different breed of cat. He was someone whose career involved going on a B-17 and raids over Germany, and a newsprint reporter who really went out and found the stories. He was stationed in Moscow for a while. He didn't have the slick, good looks of the modern TV anchor, but he was intensely believable.
They called him the most trusted man in America.
Yeah. And that came through with his demeanor and
he was
quality
devoted
of his broadcast.
He was devoted to the space program. I mean, all the networks covered the space
He
program.
was personal friends with the astronauts. Let's put it that way.
Yeah,
So
but he was. I mean, it was all consuming for
yeah.
him. And he anchored, and I think he anchored those Apollo during those
Yeah.
Apollo. I think he anchored 24/7. It was always whenever you turned on the TV, it was always him.
Yeah, he wanted to have the spotlight on that, not for self-aggrandizement, because he really devoted to it. Anyway, so that's the background, and Dad was in a meeting, and a call came in, and the guys in the meeting saw him go off and kind of mumble in the room. Well, it turned out it was Cronkite, and he wanted Dad to give a short description of the communication system, because it's tricky business communicating with a moving spacecraft on the moon, going to the moon and back. And he didn't want to do it because he didn't think it would adequately acknowledge the work by these other people. And he didn't want to blow his own horn, so he said, "Thanks very much, but no thanks." Hung up.
Turned down Walter Cronkite.
Yeah, and the guys in the PR department were just going nuts when they heard this. I mean, can you imagine a CEO today turning that kind of an opportunity down? But it's one of these apocryphal Art Collins stories that turned out to be pretty much true.
Well, these stories and so many more at the Marion Heritage Center and Museum at 7 o'clock on Thursday, October 10th, talking about your dad and growing up with Collins, and a chance for people to check out your books and meet you and hear you tell the story from a very personal angle.
I just would like to mention the Arthur A. Collins Legacy Association, in which I'm a vice president, and some wonderful guys here. Not all of them old enough to have actually worked during those times, but devoted to that history. And then, of course, a very kind invitation from the Marion folks. There's a get-together at 6. People can show up an hour early.
Yep, 6 p.m. for a social hour. I see
Yeah.
and then the program begins at 7 o'clock. Well, Michael, it's just been a pleasure and an honor having you here today. Thank you for telling us the personal stories behind the things that have been such a huge part of Cedar Rapids and the history of America as well. And I hope you have an enjoyable time on Thursday and a safe trip home.
Thank you very much. I enjoyed it.
Again, it's at the Marion Heritage and Cultural Center, and you can find out more on their website, which is marionhistoricalsociety.org. You can hear the Culture Crawl live on the radio most Thursdays and Fridays at 10:20, or watch the video podcast. I will tell you, to those listening on the air, that there'll be much more material on the podcast version than what we were able to share on the air, so you can hear the full thing there. Go to kcck.org/culture, or download and watch on your favorite podcast app. I'm Dennis Green.